In what locals called the Garden of Eden, federal investigators arrived in the summer of 1883. A Christian community in southwestern Kansas had been mysteriously abandoned overnight. Beneath the flower beds, what they discovered would haunt them forever. Without a trace, 9 families had vanished over 11 years, their leaders claiming they had departed for missionary work. But investigators found skeletal remains buried in mass graves, their life savings stolen. A sanctuary, the New Eden Christian community was not. It was a killing field. Before we continue with the story of Prophet Isaiah Richardson and his family of killers, understand this. This channel isn't for everyone. It is only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the truth behind America's most disturbing mysteries. If you're brave enough to hear stories that few channels tell, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Everything you thought you knew about faith and trust, this story will make you question. On the Kansas prairie, what happened in those 11 years would become one of the most systematically concealed crimes in American history. And tonight, you'll learn why the federal government wanted this story to disappear forever. The Kansas frontier in 1871 was still raw with possibility and danger. 60 miles southwest lay Dodge City, a lawless cattle town where gunshots punctuated Saturday nights like church bells on Sunday mornings. But 30 miles northeast of Dodge, in a fertile valley where Crooked Creek meandered through endless grassland, a different kind of settlement was taking root. Nearly 2,000 acres of prime farmland were occupied by the New Eden Christian community, purchased with what appeared to be substantial Eastern investment. Unlike the rough-hewn homesteads scattered across the prairie, New Eden boasted impressive wooden structures. A grand meeting hall with stained glass windows shipped from Chicago, multiple dormitory buildings that could house dozens of families, workshops for blacksmithing and carpentry, and most striking of all, the Prophet's House, a 3-story Victorian mansion that seemed impossibly grand for the Kansas wilderness. In the spring of 1871, Prophet Isaiah Richardson arrived in Kansas with his wife, Elder Sarah Richardson, and their 23-year-old son, Joshua. A tall, commanding figure was Isaiah, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Deep and resonant, his voice carried the authority of someone who had communed with the divine, capable of making grown men weep with conviction or tremble with fear. A different kind of power was possessed by Sarah, his wife of 26 years. The quiet, watchful intelligence of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. With an efficiency that bordered on supernatural, she managed the community's daily operations. Their son, Joshua, combined his father's physical presence with his mother's calculating mind, serving as the community's enforcer and the one who welcomed new families to their promised land. A unique doctrine was preached by the Richardson family, one they called divine simplicity. The belief that true Christians should abandon worldly possessions and live in communal harmony, sharing all resources for the greater glory of God. A life free from the struggles of frontier existence was promised to arriving families. No more failed crops. No more fear of Indian raids. No more winter starvation. In exchange, families would contribute their worldly goods to the community treasury and submit to the spiritual guidance of Prophet Isaiah. By the end of 1871, 14 families had joined the community. 28 were there by 1872. A stable population of 35 families, approximately 175 men, women, and children, was reached by New Eden in 1874, all living in what appeared to be perfect Christian harmony. Their life savings, their livestock, their tools, and most importantly, their unquestioning faith in Prophet Isaiah's divine mission, each family brought these things. With remarkable prosperity, the community thrived. Despite the harsh Kansas climate, gardens yielded vegetables in abundance. Furniture and tools of exceptional quality were produced by the workshops and sold in distant markets. 6 days a week, children attended school, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also music and art. Times of fellowship and spiritual instruction were the evening meals in the Great Hall, with Prophet Isaiah delivering sermons that spoke to the deepest longings of the human heart. But rules existed in New Eden, rules that newcomers learned gradually. Approved by Elder Sarah, all correspondence with the outside world had to be. Discouraged were visits from relatives or friends. After all, They might bring worldly influences that could corrupt the community's spiritual purity. Most importantly, complicated became leaving once families committed their worldly goods to the community treasury. Visions of families who tried to leave were shown to him by God, Prophet Isaiah explained. Terrible visions of failure, death, and damnation that awaited those who turned their backs on divine calling. Between the Richardson family, the closed-door meetings were what visitors didn't see, always held in the prophet's house after the evening meal. They didn't notice how certain families seemed to struggle with doubt or discontent, asking uncomfortable questions about community finances or challenging the absolute authority that Prophet Isaiah claimed to possess. Most importantly, they didn't realize that the beautiful gardens surrounding the meeting hall, gardens that Elder Sarah tended with such devoted care, would eventually hold secrets that would shatter their faith in humanity forever. To build a Christian community, the Richardson family had not come to Kansas. To perfect a system that would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, they had come, all while hiding their crimes behind the unassailable walls of religious devotion. On a bitter February night in 1872, the first murder happened, exactly 10 months after the Miller family had arrived at New Eden. But to understand the true horror of what occurred, we must first understand how carefully the Richardson family had planned every detail of their unholy enterprise. Restless had Herman Miller been growing. Mainly of memorizing biblical passages and learning trades that seemed designed to benefit the community rather than prepare them for independent lives consisted the promised education for his children. More troubling, Herman had begun to question the community's finances. $400 and valuable livestock he had contributed to the treasury. Yet when he asked Elder Sarah about purchasing winter clothing for his children, she had told him the community couldn't afford such luxuries. That February evening, Herman approached Prophet Isaiah after the community's dinner in the Great Hall. Unaware that they were about to witness the beginning of a pattern that would claim 9 families over the next 11 years, other families were settling into their evening routines. "Brother Isaiah," Herman said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "I've been thinking about our family's contribution to the treasury. $400 plus our livestock and tools. That's more than some men see in 5 years. Yet my wife tells me, we can't afford winter coats for the children." Swift and calculated was Prophet Isaiah's reaction. With what appeared to be righteous anger, his blue eyes flashed, but Joshua Richardson, watching from across the hall, recognized it as something else entirely, the cold fury of a predator whose prey had just revealed dangerous intelligence. Quickly the confrontation escalated, with Herman growing more insistent about accountability and Isaiah becoming more dramatically offended by what he called worldly thinking. Finally, Prophet Isaiah raised his hand for silence. "Brother Herman, I can see that the devil has been whispering doubts in your ear. Come to my house after evening prayers and we'll seek divine guidance together." At 10 o'clock that night, Herman Miller walked through the snow to the prophet's house, expecting a private discussion about his concerns. At the door, Joshua Richardson met him, explaining that his father was waiting in the study. A comfortable room on the first floor was the study, lined with religious books and warmed by a large fireplace. With minor variations, what happened next would be repeated 8 more times over the following decade. "Brother Herman," Isaiah began, his voice gentle and concerned. "I want you to know that I understand your worries. But God has shown me something remarkable about your family's future. A special mission that will bring great glory to his name." As Isaiah spoke, Herman noticed that Joshua had entered the room and was standing behind him. Suddenly uneasy made Herman something in the younger man's posture. But before he could turn around completely, Joshua's powerful hands were around his throat. Brief but violent was the struggle. A strong man was Herman Miller, hardened by years of frontier life, but he was no match for Joshua's calculated brutality. Within minutes, Herman's body lay still on the study floor, his neck broken with professional efficiency. Before coming to Kansas, the Richardson family had practiced this technique, perfecting their method of killing without leaving obvious wounds or excessive blood. For every other aspect of what they called the harvest, they had also prepared. While Joshua disposed of Herman's body in a specially prepared pit behind the prophet's house, Isaiah and Sarah went to the Miller family's quarters. With gentle voices, they woke Ruth Miller, explaining that Herman had suffered a heart attack during their prayer session and had passed peacefully into God's arms. 3 days after Herman's murder, the Miller family supposedly departed for California in the early morning hours before the rest of the community awakened. That Ruth had received a divine vision calling her family to missionary work among gold miners was explained by prophet Isaiah, and that Joshua had escorted them to the railroad station in Dodge City. Of course, alive, the Miller family never left New Eden. On that cold February morning, Ruth Miller and her 4 children joined Herman in what would become Elder Sarah's memorial garden. Swift were their deaths, poison in their morning coffee, administered by Elder Sarah with the same gentle care she showed in all her domestic duties. By the time the rest of New Eden awakened, the Miller family's belongings had been carefully sorted and stored. Their valuable items would be sold in distant towns. To the Richardson family's growing treasury, their life savings would be added, and their bodies would be buried in what Elder Sarah would designate as the community's first memorial garden, a beautiful flower bed where the faithful could remember departed loved ones and pray for missionaries spreading God's word in distant lands. The Miller family's departure was mourned by the other families in New Eden, and they prayed for their success in California. They had no idea they were praying over their graves. A pattern that would become terrifyingly routine over the next decade was established in the months following the Miller family's disappearance. A period of mourning and reflection was entered by the community. With prophet Isaiah delivering increasingly powerful sermons about sacrifice, divine calling, and the temporary nature of earthly attachments, the remaining families drew closer together, finding comfort in their shared faith and their trust in the Richardson family's spiritual guidance. Its careful pacing was the beauty of the Richardson family system. That eliminating families too frequently would create suspicion, they understood. So strategically they spaced their activities. Between murders, they focused on recruiting new families, managing the community's legitimate prosperity, and most importantly, identifying their next victims through careful psychological observation. With remarkable regularity throughout 1872 and 1873, new families continued to arrive. Drawn by stories of New Eden's success that spread through church networks across the Midwest, the community maintained its stable population of 35 families, with new arrivals replacing those who had been called to missionary service or who had left for legitimate reasons. From Ohio in the spring of 1873, Thomas Hartwell and his family arrived, bringing substantial savings and 2 teenage sons who showed promise as craftsmen. A school teacher had Thomas been, and his intellectual curiosity made him valuable for managing New Eden's educational programs. But by the autumn of 1873, Thomas had begun asking uncomfortable questions about record-keeping and financial accountability that made him dangerous to the Richardson family's control. On November 15, 1873, a sudden illness was suffered by Thomas Hartwell during evening prayers. In the meeting hall, he collapsed, writhing in apparent agony before falling still. A carefully measured dose of water hemlock had been added to Thomas's evening tea by Elder Sarah, who had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants gathered from the Kansas prairie. Thomas's tragic death was mourned by the community, and another divine vision was received by prophet Isaiah. God, he announced, had revealed that Thomas's widow, Mary, and their sons were called to join a special missionary expedition to work among the Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota Territory. 3 days after Thomas's funeral, the surviving Hartwell family supposedly departed for their new mission. Like the Miller family before them, alive, the Hartwells never left New Eden. Their bodies joined the growing collection in Elder Sarah's memorial garden. Their worldly goods added to the Richardson family's treasury, their deaths explained away by divine mission and spiritual calling. From Illinois in 1874, the Kowalski family arrived, Polish immigrants with skills in metalwork that proved valuable to the community's workshops. But an old-world skepticism about religious authority was possessed by Stefan Kowalski that made him question prophet Isaiah's absolute control over community finances. In February 1875, the Kowalski family perished in a tragic accident when their quarters caught fire during a winter storm. According to Joshua's tearful account, he had tried desperately to rescue them, but the fire spread too quickly. In 1875, Elder Peterson joined the community, bringing his wife and daughter, along with substantial banking experience that initially seemed useful for managing New Eden's increasingly complex financial operations. But by early 1876, discrepancies between the community's supposed poverty and its actual expenditures had been begun to be noticed by Peterson. During a severe prairie storm in May 1876, lightning struck Elder Peterson while working in the fields. A divine calling to missionary work among railroad construction crews in Colorado was soon received by his widow and daughter. New lessons about refining their methods were taught to the Richardson family by each elimination. They learned to vary their techniques, sometimes accidents, sometimes illness, sometimes divine calling that separated families from their resources before their elimination. They also discovered that maintaining detailed records of their victims' assets, while dangerous, was necessary for converting stolen property into usable wealth through sales in distant markets. By the end of 1876, 4 families had been eliminated, and nearly $50,000 in cash, plus valuable property and livestock, was contained in the Richardson family's private treasury. More importantly, they had perfected their system of identifying problematic families, manipulating religious devotion to maintain control, and eliminating threats while maintaining their reputation as devoted Christian leaders. That they were living alongside a carefully constructed death trap had no suspicion by the community members who remained. 4 years, the vast majority of families lived peaceful, productive lives in New Eden. They saw only the Richardson family's apparent devotion to Christian principles, the community's material prosperity, and the occasional inspiring examples of faithful families who had accepted God's calling to carry the gospel to distant and dangerous places. When letters arrived from the outside world asking about missing relatives, masterpieces of religious rhetoric and believable explanation were Elder Sarah's responses. When government officials occasionally inquired about land ownership or tax obligations, meticulous was Prophet Isaiah's documentation and apparently flawless was his legal compliance. For the Richardson family, the years 1877 through 1880 marked a period of increasing confidence, but also growing danger as their success began to attract unwanted attention. They had eliminated 4 families without creating suspicion, accumulated substantial wealth, and established New Eden as one of the most prosperous religious communities on the Kansas frontier. But success had made them bold, and boldness was about to lead them into risks that would ultimately expose their crimes. From Missouri in April 1877, the Brennan family arrived, fleeing debts that had destroyed their farming operation. An Irish Catholic had Patrick Brennan been who had converted to Protestant Christianity after marrying his wife Margaret, and this religious transition had alienated him from his extended family back east. Their 6 children, ranging from 8 to 20, were brought by the Brennans, plus nearly $700 in savings that represented their entire life's work. One quality that made him ultimately incompatible with the Richardson family system was possessed by Patrick Brennan. He was a natural investigator. His Irish Catholic background had taught him to be wary of religious authority, and his experience with financial ruin had made him skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true. By the winter of 1877, Patrick had begun asking uncomfortable questions about the families who had supposedly departed for missionary work. "Brother Isaiah," Patrick said one evening after community prayers, "I've been wondering about the families that have left for missionary work. In 3 years, I've never received a single letter from any of them, despite writing several myself. Don't missionaries usually maintain correspondence with their supporting communities?" Immediate and calculated was Prophet Isaiah's response. "Brother Patrick, I'm troubled by your lack of faith in God's mysterious ways. Families called to frontier mission work often find themselves too isolated and busy to maintain regular correspondence. We must trust that they are fulfilling God's will even when we cannot see the results." But Patrick's questions continued and they grew more specific. Why did departing families always leave so suddenly? Why were their destinations always vague and difficult to verify? Why did the community keep no official records of missionary activities that could be shared with supporting churches in other states? Their most audacious yet was the Richardson family's solution. In March 1878, they staged what appeared to be a miraculous divine intervention. During evening prayers, Prophet Isaiah suddenly collapsed, writhing on the floor of the meeting hall in apparent supernatural agony. Elder Sarah and Joshua rushed to his aid while the assembled community watched in horror as their spiritual leader seemed to battle with invisible forces. After nearly an hour of this terrifying display, Prophet Isaiah rose to his feet, his face radiant with apparent divine revelation. In a voice trembling with religious ecstasy, he announced that God had shown him a vision of terrible danger threatening New Eden. Satan, he revealed, had sent agents to infiltrate the community and destroy it from within by spreading doubt and questioning divine authority. As the primary agent of Satan's influence, Patrick Brennan, identified by this revelation, faced a choice. Submit completely to Prophet Isaiah's authority or be expelled from the community to face the harsh Kansas prairie alone with his family. Terrified by the supernatural events she had witnessed and desperate to protect her children, his wife Margaret begged Patrick to apologize and demonstrate his renewed faith. Complete and heartbreaking was Patrick's capitulation. He publicly confessed his sins before the entire community, admitted that Satan had corrupted his thoughts with doubt and suspicion, and pledged absolute obedience to Prophet Isaiah's divine guidance. But no intention of allowing Patrick Brennan to live was had by the Richardson family. His questions had been too intelligent, his skepticism too dangerous, and his influence over other families too significant. On April 20, 1878, in his sleep, Patrick Brennan died, apparently of a heart attack brought on by the spiritual stress of his battle with Satan. Devastated by Patrick's death, and convinced that his doubts had somehow caused his divine punishment, Margaret Brennan and her 6 children readily accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation that they were called to missionary work among Irish immigrants in Colorado mining camps. For the importance of religious obedience, their tragic loss would make them powerful witnesses. The now established pattern was followed by the Brennan family's departure for Colorado, except that their elimination provided the Richardson family with their largest single haul of assets, $700 in cash, plus valuable personal property that could be sold discreetly in distant markets. Between 1879 and 1881, 2 more families would fall victim to the Richardson system. The Schmidt family, German immigrants who made the mistake of questioning the community's lack of contact with Lutheran churches in their homeland, died in a food poisoning incident that affected only their household. The Caldwell family met their end in 1881 when Patriarch William Caldwell's drinking problem led him to make indiscreet comments about missing families and suspicious deaths. But it was the elimination of the Caldwell family that would ultimately bring down the Richardson enterprise because it included a victim who was too young to be manipulated by religious authority and too intelligent to accept the explanations that satisfied traumatized adults. On the frontier, 16-year-old Emma Caldwell had grown up where death was a frequent visitor and children learned early to observe adult behavior with careful attention. With simple observation after her mother's natural death from consumption in late 1880, Emma's investigation began. She noticed that very specific questions about her mother's family back east were asked by Elder Sarah. Did they write letters regularly? Would they expect to hear from the Caldwells soon? How much did they know about the family's plans in Kansas? When Emma was helping Elder Sarah sort through her mother's belongings, she noticed that all correspondence and family records were set aside by Elder Sarah. These documents will be important when God calls your family to missionary service, Elder Sarah explained, speaking as if such a calling was already determined rather than merely possible. To patterns in the community's missionary departures, Emma began paying attention. She realized that families chosen for elimination were always those who had questioned community policies or possessed resources that made their elimination particularly profitable. More disturbing was her discovery of a hidden storage room beneath the prophet's house containing personal belongings from families who had supposedly departed for frontier missions but had left behind their most precious possessions. In January 1881, a desperate decision was made by Emma. Detailed letters describing her observations and suspicions were written by her, addressing them to the sheriff in Dodge City, the federal marshal in Wichita, and her mother's brother in Illinois. But before she could mail the letters, her activities were discovered by Elder Sarah. The established pattern was followed by the Caldwell family's elimination in February 1881. But Emma's desperate attempt to expose the truth had planted the first seeds of fear in the Richardson family's minds. For the first time since they had begun their murderous enterprise, they faced the possibility that their crimes might be discovered and punished. In the wake of Emma Caldwell's investigation, The Richardson family's growing paranoia led them to make their first serious mistakes in nearly a decade of perfect murders. Emma's attempted exposure had failed, but her intelligence and determination had shown them how vulnerable their system could be to a victim who was smart enough to recognize patterns and brave enough to seek outside help. The beginning of the end for the Richardson family's reign of terror was marked by the elimination of the Caldwell family in February 1881, though they didn't realize it at the time. Emma's death had been necessary to protect their enterprise, but her final words, shouted in desperation as Joshua cornered her against a cliff face, would haunt elder Sarah for months afterward. "I wrote 3 letters. They're already mailed. Everyone will know what you've done here." Emma had been lying, of course. The letters were still hidden in her clothing, never having reached any post office or government official. But her bluff achieved something no other victim had managed. It planted genuine fear in the Richardson family's minds about the possibility of outside investigation. A series of decisions that would ultimately expose their crimes was led to by this fear. First, they decided to accelerate their timeline for leaving Kansas, planning to liquidate their remaining assets and relocate to California before any potential investigation could threaten them. Second, they began eliminating evidence more aggressively, burning documents and personal items that they had previously preserved as trophies of their successful operations. Most fatally, they decided to eliminate one final family before their departure, the Hoffmans, recent German immigrants who possessed both substantial savings and knowledge of their homeland's banking systems that could be valuable for establishing new identities in California. But from all previous operations, the Hoffman elimination in June 1882 differed because it was motivated by greed rather than necessity and because it was planned hastily rather than with the careful preparation that had characterized their earlier crimes. A successful merchant in Prussia had Klaus Hoffmann been before immigrating to Kansas with his wife Greta and their 3 teenage children. His European business interests had been sold by him for a substantial sum, converting his wealth into American currency and government bonds that he planned to use for establishing a new trading operation in the American West. The largest single financial opportunity the Richardson family had ever encountered was represented by the Hoffman family's arrival at New Eden in May 1882. But Klaus Hoffman was also the most sophisticated victim they had ever targeted. His experience with international banking made him naturally suspicious of New Eden's unusual financial arrangements, and his knowledge of German immigrant communities across the Midwest meant that his disappearance would be more likely to trigger outside investigation than the elimination of isolated frontier families. The Richardson family's desperation to acquire the Hoffman assets before their planned departure led them to abandon their usual careful patience. Instead of spending months evaluating Klaus's psychology and planning his elimination, they decided to act within weeks of his arrival. This haste led to their first serious operational error in a decade of perfect crimes. On the night of June 15, 1882, the Richardson family attempted to eliminate Klaus Hoffman using their standard technique of a private spiritual consultation in the prophet's house study. But suspicious of the community's operations since his arrival had Klaus been, and he had taken the precaution of telling his wife Greta to expect his return by midnight and to alert other community members if he failed to appear. When Joshua Richardson attempted to overpower Klaus during the fake spiritual session, unexpected resistance was encountered by him. Not only younger and stronger than previous victims was Klaus Hoffman, but he was also prepared for the possibility of violence. Loud and prolonged was the struggle that followed, creating noise that could be heard throughout the prophet's house and raising the possibility that other community members might investigate. More seriously, Klaus managed to wound Joshua with a letter opener before being killed, creating a blood trail and obvious signs of violence that could not be explained away as natural death or accident. For the first time in their criminal careers, the Richardson family faced the challenge of explaining obvious evidence of murder to community members who had been awakened by the sounds of struggle. Characteristically audacious but ultimately self-destructive was their solution. The next morning, Prophet Isaiah announced that Klaus Hoffman had been possessed by demonic forces during their spiritual consultation, requiring a violent exorcism that had ultimately resulted in the demon's departure and Klaus's peaceful death. The traumatized community members who had heard the struggle were satisfied by this explanation, but it also created the first cracks in the Richardson family's reputation for divine authority and peaceful community leadership. Devastated by Klaus's death, and terrified by the supernatural explanations they had been given, Greta Hoffmann and her children readily accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation that they were called to return to Germany as missionaries to their former homeland. For early July, their departure from New Eden was scheduled, supposedly to catch a ship from New York back to Europe. But alive, the Hoffmann family never left Kansas. And their elimination on July 3, 1882, was witnessed by someone the Richardson family had never considered a threat: 8-year-old Timothy Weber, son of one of New Eden's most devoted families, who had been hiding in the Prophet's house barn during a game of hide-and-seek when the murders occurred. Joshua Richardson loading bodies into a wagon was seen by Timothy, and instructions about burial locations in the memorial garden were heard being given by Elder Sarah. Too young to understand the full implications of what he had witnessed was the child, but he was old enough to realize that the Hoffmann family had not actually departed for Germany as announced to the community. The first serious crack in the Richardson family's control over community information was created by Timothy's innocent questions to his parents about why the Hoffmanns were buried in the garden instead of traveling to Germany. With his son's confused report, when Timothy's father, Elder Weber, approached Prophet Isaiah, he received explanations that seemed increasingly strained and inconsistent. For the first time in 11 years, a member of New Eden's community began to seriously question the official explanations for mysterious deaths and sudden departures. A level of internal threat that the Richardson family had never faced before was created by Elder Weber's growing suspicions, combined with his knowledge of Timothy's eyewitness account. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of New Eden, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far is the truth about what happened next. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. That their decade of perfect murders had finally created a witness they could not eliminate without destroying the community that provided cover for their crimes was about to be discovered by the Richardson family. Not with law enforcement, but with a persistent mother named Catherine Brennan McKenna, the older sister of Patrick Brennan, who had been murdered in 1878, began the investigation that would ultimately expose the Richardson family's crimes. In St. Louis, Catherine lived, where her husband, Michael McKenna, worked as a federal customs inspector. Unlike most relatives of New Eden's victims, Catherine possessed both the resources and the government connections necessary to pursue a thorough investigation into her brother's disappearance. Troubled had Catherine been by the complete lack of communication from Patrick's family since their supposed departure for Colorado missionary work in April 1878. A faithful correspondent throughout his adult life had Patrick been, writing regularly to his sister, even during the most difficult periods of his farming struggles in Missouri. Entirely out of character seemed his complete silence after joining New Eden, especially given that he had 6 children whose lives Catherine would have expected him to share through letters. In the spring of 1882, Catherine convinced her husband to use his federal connections to make official inquiries about the Brennan family's whereabouts. Federal Indian agents in Colorado Territory, railroad companies that handled passenger traffic to mining regions, and Catholic missionary organizations that worked among Irish immigrants in the Western Territories were contacted by Michael McKenna. Disturbing were the results. No record existed of any family named Brennan engaging in missionary activities in Colorado or any other Western location during the specified time periods. Armed with this information, Catherine and Michael traveled to Kansas in August 1882, determined to visit New Eden and demand answers about Patrick's family. Very differently would their investigation have proceeded if they had announced their arrival in advance. But fortunately for the cause of justice, they decided to approach New Eden unannounced, hoping to observe the community's normal operations before revealing their purpose. During their 3-day reconnaissance of New Eden, what Catherine and Michael observed was a community that seemed prosperous and well organized, but also strangely tense and secretive. On hills overlooking the settlement, they positioned themselves, using Michael's military field glasses to study the daily routines of community members. About New Eden's operations and the Richardson family's explanations for missing relatives, immediate questions were raised by what they saw. Well-maintained and recently expanded were the community's buildings, suggesting access to significant financial resources that seemed inconsistent with a struggling religious settlement dependent on donations. Expensive farm equipment sat in the workshops, and the quality of livestock visible in the pastures indicated substantial investment in agricultural operations that would require more capital than 35 frontier families could reasonably provide. More disturbing were the behavioral patterns Catherine noticed among the community members. During evening gatherings visible through the meeting hall windows, people seemed to demonstrate an almost frantic enthusiasm for religious activities as if they were performing their devotion rather than expressing genuine spiritual joy. Subdued and watchful appeared children, exhibiting the kind of hyper-alert behavior Catherine recognized from her work with immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Ireland. Most significantly, something that confirmed their worst suspicions about New Eden's true nature was witnessed by Catherine and Michael. On their third morning of observation, they saw Elder Weber approach Prophet Isaiah with what appeared to be urgent concerns, accompanied by his young son, Timothy. Clearly agitated was the conversation that followed, with Prophet Isaiah's usual commanding demeanor giving way to obvious anxiety and defensive gestures. That evening, Catherine and Michael approached New Eden openly, presenting themselves as relatives of Patrick Brennan and demanding to speak with community leaders about his family's current location. A stir of activity that confirmed their suspicions was created by their arrival. This was not a community accustomed to unexpected visitors or comfortable with outside scrutiny. In the community's meeting hall, Prophet Isaiah Richardson met them, flanked by Elder Sarah and Joshua. Smooth and confident was his initial response to their inquiries, explaining that the Brennan family had indeed departed for missionary work in Colorado and was doing excellent work among Irish miners in remote mountain valleys. Letters supposedly written by Patrick describing the family's successful ministry and their plans to establish a permanent mission station in an isolated location were produced by him. But Catherine had not spent 40 years reading her brother's correspondence without learning to recognize his handwriting and writing style. Obvious forgeries were the letters Prophet Isaiah showed her. The handwriting was similar, but not identical, and the language was formal and religious in a way that Patrick, despite his spiritual devotion, had never used in personal correspondence. Most damning, the letters contained geographical references that Catherine knew were incorrect, describing mining operations in locations where no such activities existed. These letters were not written by my brother, Catherine stated flatly, her Irish temper beginning to show. Patrick would never describe the Colorado Rockies as having gentle valleys suitable for farming and family settlement. He served in the Colorado Territory during the war, and he knew those mountains were harsh and dangerous. The first serious cracks in the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade were revealed by the confrontation that followed. Nothing to Catherine McKenna, who had been raised in the Irish Catholic tradition of questioning Protestant ministers, meant Prophet Isaiah's religious authority. Impossible to dismiss their concerns or intimidate them into leaving made it her husband's federal credentials. Most importantly, their announced intention to report New Eden to territorial authorities meant that the Richardson family could not simply make them disappear like previous troublemakers. When Michael McKenna, using his federal investigator training, began asking specific questions about New Eden's legal status and financial operations, the breakthrough came. How was the community's land ownership documented? What records existed of the substantial property transfers that would be necessary for families to donate their worldly goods to community treasury? Where were the tax records that territorial law required for large agricultural operations? Evasive and inconsistent were Prophet Isaiah's responses to these questions. He claimed that community finances were managed through divine guidance rather than earthly record-keeping, that legal documentation was unnecessary for families who had transcended worldly concerns, and that tax obligations were handled through special arrangements with territorial authorities that outsiders couldn't understand. That New Eden was operating outside legal boundaries in ways that suggested criminal activity was confirmed by these answers. As a federal customs inspector, he had extensive experience recognizing financial fraud and property crime. The community's obvious prosperity, combined with the lack of legitimate documentation for its resources, suggested systematic theft on a massive scale. But it was 8-year-old Timothy Weber who provided the evidence that would finally expose the Richardson family's crimes. During the heated discussion between the adults, Timothy approached his father and whispered something that made Elder Weber's face turn pale with shock. When Elder Weber reluctantly shared his son's information, the truth about New Eden began to emerge. The Hoffman family's burial in Elder Sarah's memorial garden had been seen by Timothy, contradicting the official story of their departure for Germany. More importantly, his innocent questions had led Elder Weber to examine the garden more carefully, revealing disturbing inconsistencies in the soil and unusual arrangements of flowers that suggested systematic burial of multiple bodies over several years. That night, a decision that would finally bring justice to New Eden's victims was made by Catherine and Michael. Instead of confronting the Richardson family further, they quietly departed for Dodge City, where Michael's federal credentials would allow them to request an official investigation by territorial marshals. They carried with them Timothy Weber's eyewitness testimony, Elder Weber's observations about the memorial garden, and most importantly, evidence of systematic financial fraud that would justify federal intervention. With growing panic, the Richardson family watched the McKennas leave, realizing that their perfect system was facing its most serious threat ever. For the first time in 11 years of successful murders, they faced investigation by federal authorities who possessed both the resources and the legal authority to expose their crimes. On September 10, 1882, the federal investigation of New Eden began when Deputy U.S. Marshal James Crawford arrived at the community with warrants to examine financial records and interview residents about missing persons reports filed by relatives in multiple states. Accompanied was Crawford by a territorial attorney, a federal land office inspector, and 2 deputy sheriffs from Ford County. They also brought something the Richardson family had never encountered before: legal authority that transcended religious claims and community autonomy. A community in the grip of carefully controlled panic was what the investigators found during their first day at New Eden. The previous 3 weeks had been spent by the Richardson family preparing for this possibility, coaching community members on appropriate responses to official questions and hiding or destroying evidence that might reveal the true scope of their crimes. But they had also made a fatal error that would ultimately expose everything. So confident in their system had they become that they had kept detailed records of their victims' property and possessions, believing these records would serve as evidence of legitimate business transactions rather than proof of systematic murder. Almost anticlimactic was Marshal Crawford's discovery of the hidden vault beneath the prophet's house. After hours of examining suspicious financial records and interviewing terrified community members, the vault contained personal belongings from 9 families carefully catalogued and stored with the efficiency of a criminal enterprise. Family photographs, personal Bibles, children's toys, wedding rings, and most damning of all, identity documents that proved these families had never left New Eden alive. But the physical evidence that finally broke the case was Elder Sarah's memorial garden, the beautiful flower beds where she had spent 11 years carefully tending blooms above the graves of her victims. When investigators began excavating the garden based on Timothy Weber's eyewitness testimony and his father's observations, they uncovered a carefully organized cemetery containing the remains of 47 men, women, and children buried in family groups with their personal possessions and arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of the Richardson family's criminal activities. Swift and absolute was the Richardson family's arrest. Prophet Isaiah Richardson, Elder Sarah Richardson, and Joshua Richardson were taken into custody and charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous charges of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Traumatized by the revelation that they had been living above a mass grave for years, the surviving members of New Eden provided testimony that painted a horrifying picture of systematic manipulation, religious abuse, and calculated murder. One of the most sensational criminal cases in Kansas territorial history became the trial of the Richardson family, attracting newspaper coverage from across the nation and sparking congressional debates about federal oversight of religious communities. Not just the scope of their crimes, but the sophisticated psychological techniques they had used to maintain control over their victims and conceal their activities from outside scrutiny were revealed by the evidence presented during the proceedings. Methodically around 3 devastating categories of evidence, the prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney William Harrison, built their case. Physical proof of the murders found in Elder Sarah's garden, documentary evidence of systematic theft found in the hidden vault, and testimony from traumatized survivors that revealed the psychological manipulation techniques used to control community members. Overwhelming and undeniable was the physical evidence. A consistent pattern of death that demolished any possibility of accidental mortality or natural causes was revealed by coroner's examinations of the 47 bodies. Signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma to the skull were typically shown by men. Evidence of poisoning with bone samples containing traces of water hemlock and other toxic plants that Elder Sarah had cultivated in hidden sections of her garden for purposes that were now horrifyingly clear was often exhibited by women and children. An equally damning story of systematic financial crime was told by the documentary evidence found in the vault. Meticulous records of their victims' assets had been kept by the Richardson family, tracking everything from cash savings to livestock values to personal property that could be sold in distant markets. That the family had accumulated more than $150,000 in cash and convertible assets over 11 years, a fortune that would be equivalent to millions of dollars in modern currency, was revealed by these records. To any possible defense, most damaging was the testimony of New Eden survivors, particularly Elder Weber and his son Timothy, whose innocent observations had triggered the investigation. A community where religious devotion had been weaponized to ensure absolute obedience and where questioning authority was portrayed as spiritual rebellion worthy of divine punishment was revealed by their accounts. Particularly devastating was Elder Weber's testimony. "We trusted them completely," he said, his voice breaking as he described years of witnessing suspicious disappearances. "When families would vanish overnight, we accepted the explanations because we believed Prophet Isaiah spoke with God's voice. We were told that doubt was the devil's work, that questioning divine revelations was the same as questioning God himself. We were fools and our foolishness cost innocent people their lives. That the Richardson family was suffering from religious delusions that made them legally insane was attempted to be argued by the defense attorneys. But this strategy collapsed when prosecutors revealed the meticulous planning and calculated execution that characterized their crimes. No mentally incompetent individuals could have maintained such sophisticated operations for 11 years, managing complex financial records, manipulating government inspections, and coordinating the elimination of 9 families without leaving evidence that led to earlier discovery. The final nail in his family's legal coffin proved to be Prophet Isaiah Richardson's own testimony. Convinced even during his trial that he possessed divine authority, Isaiah attempted to justify his actions by claiming that God had revealed to him which families were worthy of salvation and which were destined for destruction. His complete lack of remorse, combined with his detailed knowledge of each family's elimination, demonstrated a level of premeditation that made the death penalty inevitable under Kansas territorial law. For less than 3 hours, the jury deliberated before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against all 3 defendants. Sentenced to death by hanging were Prophet Isaiah Richardson, Elder Sarah Richardson, and Joshua Richardson, with their executions scheduled for November 15, 1882, exactly 9 years after Thomas Hartwell had become their second victim. Simultaneously on 3 gallows erected in the town square of Dodge City, the executions were carried out, witnessed by nearly 1,500 people who had traveled from across Kansas and neighboring territories to see justice served for one of the most heinous crimes in American frontier history. That all 3 members of the Richardson family went to their deaths, maintaining their claims of divine authority, was reported by local newspapers, with Prophet Isaiah's final words being a prediction that God would vindicate their actions and punish those who had opposed his sacred mission. Profound implications that extended far beyond the punishment of the Richardson family had the aftermath of the New Eden massacre. New oversight requirements for isolated religious communities were implemented by the federal government, mandating regular inspections and financial audits that would make similar crimes much more difficult to conceal. As evidence for the need for stronger territorial law enforcement, the case was used by congressional investigators, leading to expanded federal marshal services and improved communication systems for tracking missing persons across state and territorial boundaries. The difficult task of rebuilding their lives after years of psychological manipulation and trauma was faced by the surviving members of New Eden. Most returned to their original home states, aided by federal compensation payments funded through the sale of the Richardson family's stolen assets. For what physicians of the era diagnosed as nervous exhaustion, but which modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, several survivors required ongoing medical care. A celebrated figure in newspaper accounts of the case became Catherine Brennan McKenna, whose persistent investigation had triggered the discovery of New Eden's crimes. For improved federal oversight of religious communities and better protection for families seeking refuge in isolated settlements, she used her newfound public platform to advocate legislation that required territorial authorities to maintain regular contact with religious communities and to investigate any reports of missing persons with federal resources was contributed to by her efforts. Immediately after the trials, the physical site of New Eden was abandoned, with territorial authorities declaring the land unsuitable for future settlement due to its association with mass murder. Cursed was claimed the property by local folklore, and indeed several attempts to establish new settlements on the land failed due to mysterious accidents and unexplained difficulties. Gradually, the buildings fell into ruin, and by the early 1900s, nothing remained of the community except foundation stones and the carefully tended gardens where Elder Sarah had hidden her victims' graves. One of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in 19th-century American history is considered the New Eden Massacre by modern historians who have studied it. Remarkable not just for its scope and duration, but for the psychological techniques the Richardson family used to maintain their operation. As an early example of organized criminal activity disguised as religious authority, the case has been identified by criminal psychologists, establishing patterns that would unfortunately be repeated in various forms throughout American history. A chilling reminder of how religious devotion can be manipulated by those who understand human psychology and exploit the natural human need for community and spiritual guidance is served by the story of New Eden. It demonstrates how isolation and authority can be used to control victims so completely that they participate in their own destruction, believing until the very end that they are serving a divine purpose rather than feeding a family of calculating killers. Perhaps most disturbing of all, how easily a community can become complicit in systematic evil when that evil is presented as religious duty and spiritual necessity is revealed by the Richardson family's crimes. Naive or foolish were not the families who died at New Eden. They were faithful Christians seeking a better life for their children, people whose trust and devotion were weaponized against them by individuals who understood exactly how to exploit the deepest human needs for meaning, belonging, and divine purpose. More than a statistical tragedy are represented by the 9 families who perished in the Kansas prairie between 1872 and 1882, the Millers, Hartwells, Kowalskis, Petersons, Brennans, Hoffmans, Schmidts, Caldwells, and one final family whose name was lost to history. They represent the ultimate betrayal of faith, the corruption of religious community, and the terrible price paid when absolute power meets absolute evil in the isolated spaces where civilization's protective eyes cannot see. That the greatest evil often comes not from obvious monsters, but from those who present themselves as servants of light, while serving only their own dark appetites for power and wealth is shown to us by this mystery. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Richardson family's crimes? Or could there have been even more victims whose disappearances were never connected to New Eden? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. More terrifying than any supernatural horror is often the truth about human evil. And waiting to be told are more stories like this. See you in the next video.